Chapter 10. The weight of the body pressed down on me, grinding my bony hip and shoulder into the greasy ground. He tried to kiss my mouth, and I did the only thing I was capable of doing in that position. I bit his cheek. My teeth sank into flesh. I gagged as the tang of blood filled my mouth. The brute reared back, screaming and clutching his face, but he didn't get off me. He raised his massive paw to strike me. Then suddenly he was gone, whipped off me by someone dressed in a dark hood. The newcomer punched my assailant in the stomach, then shoved him away. My attacker crumpled like a doll and lay entirely still except for the blood oozing from the wound in his stomach. He hadn't been punched. He'd been stabbed. And he was dead. The wisp of smoky haze rising from the body told me that. It formed the man's shape, right down to the abundance of whiskers and broad hands. It was the man's spirit, yet I hadn't touched the body in order to see it. Either that had been the situation all along, or my power had grown stronger. The spirit didn't look at me but at his murderer. He bared his teeth. "Damn you! You tricked me!" The smoky essence thinned and floated past me as if on a breeze. I leaned away from him, but he didn't touch me. I blinked and he was gone. Only the body remained, and my rescuer. Or the man I had to fight off next. He pushed his hood back and I gasped. "Fitzroy!" I choked on the name, relief bringing fresh tears and tightening my throat. He crouched at my side and helped me to sit. The corset made it difficult to do on my own. He stroked my hair off my face and checked me over by the miserly light of the street lamp. His touch was entirely clinical. "Are you harmed?" His voice quavered ever so slightly. I had some bruises on my thighs, but I wouldn't tell him about those. I couldn't, anyway. Speaking had suddenly become the most difficult thing to do. I simply shook my head and fought hard to not let my tears overwhelm me. But when his face softened and he picked me up, it all became too much. I pressed my cheek to his chest and sobbed. It was pathetic, but cathartic too. My fear flowed away along with my tears until there was nothing left but a sense of well-being. It was wrong to feel grateful to be in the arms of my captor, yet I couldn't bring myself to hate him. My relief was too great, the strength of his arms too comforting. He was keeping me safe, just like he'd promised. He did not set me down. We walked for some time through the dark streets, not speaking. His arms didn't loosen around me. If anything, they seemed to tighten. I couldn't see his face, tucked under his chin as I was, but I could hear his heartbeat. It had been erratic at first, but was now steady. "Where are you taking me?" I asked. We seemed to have left the slums. The houses we walked past were larger, the streets emptier. It was late. "Home." I don't have a home. I closed my eyes and listened to his heartbeat again. The rhythm lulled me and chased away the memory of that brute's fingers, his stench, and my fear. I felt more like myself again, with a clearer head, and a sense of dignity that had been absent since I realized what he'd intended to do. "You can put me down now," I told Fitzroy. "I won't run off." I needed to stand on my own 2 feet again, no matter how much I liked being in his arms. That was entirely the problem. I liked it too much. He didn't respond immediately, but walked several more paces before finally setting me on my feet. We were between street lamps, so I couldn't make out anything more than his silhouette. "It's not far," he said, and set off again. "How did you know where to find me?" I asked. He shortened his stride so that I could keep up easily. "I followed you." I frowned. "You've been watching me?" "Yes." "All day? Ever since dropping me off in Whitechapel?" Yes. His words slowly sank in. My God. I'd been right when I thought he was trying to make a point. Only I hadn't expected him to go so far as to leave me behind. When he had, I'd assumed I'd gotten him wrong and he decided to let me go after all. But this was beyond comprehension. I stopped. He stopped too, and his gaze met mine. You never had any intention of setting me free, I murmured. I shook my head over and over, no longer certain of this man. He'd been so kind as he picked me up, only because he felt guilty at leaving me there dressed as a woman with no weapons or money. I went to punch him in the chest where my tears dampened his coat, but he caught my fist. I needed you to help me, he said. I needed you to see that you're better off at Litchfield. I backed away from him, but was stopped by the low brick fence of the church behind me. That is a horrible thing to do to a woman, to anyone. Your stubbornness only makes you suffer, Charlie. I am not doing it from stubbornness. I'm trying to stay alive. And look how that worked out. I pressed my lips together and crossed my arms. I could try running away, but he would catch me. Or he might let me leave entirely, and I would once again be vulnerable and alone. And I was so tired of feeling that way. You may be alive out here, he said, but it's not a good life. You know that. Stop pretending to know what I think. And anyway, how can I trust you after that little test? I give you my word. It's all I have to offer, but I hope you know me well enough to believe me. Ha! You have to trust me, Charlie. The alternative is that. Tears burned my eyes again as the memory of that brute came crashing back. It had been as bad as my first night alone, taken by the man who tried to sell me to the highest bidder. Worse, perhaps, because now I was aware of what could happen. 5 years ago I'd been naive. I sniffed and inclined my head in a nod. Congratulations. You win. I give in. I marched off in the same direction we'd been heading. He quickly caught up and we walked side by side in silence. I'd hoped for an apology, but none came. At least he didn't gloat. Your heart is made of ice, I hissed at him. It was for your own good. If I were you, I'd keep quiet. Say the wrong thing and I might change my mind, and you are not very good at saying the right thing in my opinion. Mercifully, he remained silent. It was too dark to see what he thought of my snippy response, and I was too tired to care. We strode through the Litchfield Towers gate, and I sighed, not out of frustration, but contentment. I was moments away from food and a soft bed. I wanted a bath, too, to wash away the grit of the street, the stink of that man. Lights blazed from every window in the house, even from the tallest room in the central tower. I wondered if I would find myself back up there, or if I were to remain in Fitzroy's rooms. The front door was thrown open before we reached it. Seth and Gus tumbled out, grins splitting their faces. Were they happy to see me again? How odd. I smiled back. To my surprise, I was glad to see them, but I wouldn't tell them that. They both looked me over, then with satisfied nods, stepped aside to let us through. Good, Seth said, for no apparent reason. Welcome back, Miss Charlotte, Gus said, tugging on his forelock as a working man would do as a lady passed. Call me Charlie, or I'm leaving immediately. His gulp was audible. He shot a startled glance Fitzroy's way. It was a joke. I patted the poor man's arm. He blushed brightly in response. Ignore him, Seth said. He offered me his arm. Cook has some treats lined up for you. Jellies, candied fruit, even ice cream. Shall I bring it up to your room? Yes, thank you. That's very kind of you to organize sweets for me. His smile faded. It wasn't me that ordered them. His gaze flicked to Fitzroy, then away. I frowned at Fitzroy, but he was already moving off. "Draw a bath for her," he told Gus, "and show her to her new room. There's no need to set a guard on the door. We'll talk in the morning, Charlie." He took the stairs 2 at a time and disappeared from sight. We 3 let out a collective sigh, the tension having left with him. "Was it much of an ordeal?" Seth asked me. "I'd rather not talk about it." Gus smacked his friend's arm. "Idiot! Leave her be." "Go and draw the bath," Seth told him. To me, he said, "We're glad you're back, miss. Charlie, you might not know it, but your presence has livened this place up." I couldn't help laughing. It must have been terribly dull beforehand. "Aye," Gus said, casting a glance at the stairs. I took his arm, surprising him into another blush. "Will you show me to my room now, please?" "Right you are, Mum. Miss Charlie." Seth wandered off toward the kitchens, chuckling, and I walked with Gus up the stairs. Now that I'd made the decision to stay, I felt more at ease. I would keep my promise and not try to escape. Yet I would also try to keep my feelings in check. Fitzroy had proved he was ruthless in getting his own way. He was not to be trusted. I'd be a fool to put myself at his mercy, physically or emotionally. I'd not made the mistake of trusting someone in a long time, and I wasn't about to begin now. Lady Harcourt came to my new room the following morning. She was dressed in a steel grey gown that would look grim on anyone else, but looked elegant on her, with its slender fit, large bustle and white frills at cuff and collar. She was followed by Fitzroy. I hadn't seen him since our return the night before. His eyes seemed a little tight as he regarded me from beneath half-lowered lashes. If he was annoyed, I doubted it could be because of me this time. I'd done exactly as he'd asked. Lady Harcourt also seemed somewhat provoked as she greeted me with a brief smile. I suspected they'd argued about something. Me? Or perhaps Fitzroy's methods. "It's a little warm for a fire," she said, glancing at the fireplace. She gasped when she saw what was burning in the grate. "Oh, Charlie, you didn't." "It accidentally caught fire." "How?" "It somehow found itself in the grate among the kindling with a flame put to it." She gave me a withering glare. "If you didn't want to wear the corset, you could have simply left it off when you dressed this morning. There was no need to burn it." I beg to differ. I felt a very strong need to destroy the damned thing. Fitzroy added a scoop of coal to the fire. "How do you find your new rooms?" he asked, straightening. "Very nice, thank you." While the bedroom and adjoining sitting room were better than the tower chamber, they weren't as spacious as his suite. My new abode was located down the hall from his and was comfortably furnished. It was better than I expected. "Do you have everything you need?" Seth delivered the books earlier. "You ought to sew," Lady Harcourt said. "Do you remember how?" "I think so." I'd never been very good at sewing, always rushing my stitches, frustrating my mother. Her needlepoint had been particularly fine, but she'd had far more patience than me. "When you come to live with me, I'll see that you're given something simple to begin with." "Live with you? But I thought I was to remain here." I glared at Fitzroy, but he was looking at Lady Harcourt. "Julia," he intoned, "that's not how we agreed to approach this." Lady Harcourt sighed and swanned further into the room. The sitting room was small enough that the presence of 3 people filled it. Fitzroy in particular looked much too large for the room. He stood near me, making me very aware of the power contained within his tall frame. For the first time since it happened, I thought of how he'd killed the man who'd accosted me beneath the bridge. Fitzroy had not given him a chance to beg forgiveness. He'd stabbed him as he would a sack of grain, and left his body there to be picked over by thieves and rats. As glad as I'd been at the time, today I was struck by the brutality of it, the coldness. Yet only moments later he carried me gently away from the scene. Lady Harcourt pressed a flat palm to her stomach and seemed to be gathering herself. "Very well," she said. "Charlie, I've come to ask you once again to live with me. Now that you have agreed to help, there is no need to lock you up." "No, thank you. I have no desire to wear corsets and scrub your floors." Her fingers splayed. "You don't have to be a servant. You may be my companion." "What does a companion do?" She shrugged. "We sit together, talk and walk together. You can pay calls with me." "On who?" "My friends." It didn't sound like something I'd like to do, but I didn't want to offend her. "I prefer to remain here." She opened her mouth to protest, but Fitzroy cut in. "Charlie has given her decision. You promised to abide by it." "Yes, but I'm not sure she's thoroughly thought it through." Lady Harcourt turned a winning smile onto me. "What is there for a girl to do here?" "Gamble and play cards," I told her. She clicked her tongue. "Drink whiskey and smoke cigars." "Charlie, really, now you're just being stubborn." "Apparently I make a habit of it," I said, ignoring Fitzroy as best as I could. "She won't come to any harm here," he assured her. "You know that, Julia. Indeed, you also know that this is the safest place for her, while we try to draw VF out. I won't expose her to danger because you believe she needs feminine company." It was quite the speech, and I was surprised at his vehemence. It would seem he took my safety seriously. "Very well," she huffed. "I'll have some embroidery sent around, and you are to keep Gus and Seth on a tight leash. If anything happens to her, nothing will happen," I said. "They're not going to compromise me under Fitzroy's nose. He'll skin them alive." He lifted his brows at Lady Harcourt in what I suspected was triumph, but I wasn't entirely sure. She sighed. "Then that is that. I'll retreat. I must dash anyway, but I'd like a word with Charlie alone before I go." Fitzroy bowed, then left us. Once the door was shut, Lady Harcourt picked up the fire iron and stabbed at the burnt corset. Her vigorous thrusts quickly made her breathless. I could have told her she'd be able to breathe better if she threw her own corset into the fire, but I didn't think the suggestion would be welcomed. "Do you have your courses?" she asked. "Pardon?" "Your monthly woman's courses?" No. It stopped some time ago." She eyed me up and down. "That can occur with underweight girls. I expect now that you're eating it will return. I'll have linen sent to you along with the sewing." "Thank you, my lady." "You're very kind." I meant it. She'd thought of difficulties that hadn't even occurred to me. "I know you're worried about how a girl who doesn't like to wear corsets will behave around the men, but I can assure you I am not interested in those sorts of activities." She stabbed at the ruined corset again. "Not yet." I sighed. "Fitzroy won't allow it under his roof anyway. He'll make sure the men treat me with respect." Stab, stab, stab. "And I won't tempt them." I laughed. It sounded ridiculous. As if I could, anyway. She stopped and placed the fire iron in the stand. "You underestimate yourself, Charlie. And I think you underestimate men, too." She lifted a finger when I opened my mouth to protest. "Men, not boys. They are not the same. Well, some are, but many are not. Now tell me something." "What?" I mumbled, unsure if I'd been chastised or advised. "How did Fitzroy convince you to stay and help us?" "He didn't tell you?" She smiled sweetly and hooked her arm through mine. "I thought I'd ask you." Perhaps you ought to ask him. I extricated myself, but not before I felt her fingers tense on my arm. I headed for the door and opened it. Fitzroy wasn't there, and nor were any of the men. It took me a moment to remember that I was no longer a prisoner. I walked down the stairs with Lady Harcourt. We found Fitzroy in the library, propped against the windowsill, a book in hand. He looked up as we came in and closed the book. "We need to talk." I wasn't sure if he spoke to me or Lady Harcourt, and whether his announcement meant the others should leave. Lady Harcourt, however, seemed to know. She gave him her hand, and he bowed over it. "I look forward to your report," she said. "I'll be in touch with the committee soon." He walked her out, leaving me alone in the library. I picked up the book he'd been reading, A Guide to the Spirit World. How curious. I flipped it open and began to read, but didn't get very far before he returned. Outside, Lady Harcourt's carriage rolled away. "Tea and cake?" he asked. "Cook has been baking." "I'm not hungry." "You need to eat." Breakfast wasn't that long ago. He tugged on the bell pull in the corner of the library. The house was so vast that I couldn't hear the corresponding bell ringing in the service area. He stood by the table while we waited, hands behind his back, and nodded at the book. "You should read that. It might help you understand your necromancy." Seth entered. "Can I get you anything, Charlie?" His smile made him even more handsome, and not, for the first time, I wondered why he was working for Fitzroy alongside a ruffian like Gus. "Tea and cake." Fitzroy's gruff manner wiped Seth's smile from his face. Once he was gone, Fitzroy indicated I should sit at the table. I did, and a moment later, as though it were an afterthought, he did too. "Now that you've agreed to help, I want to keep you informed," he said. "You do? Oh, thank you. Is there more to what you've already told me?" "Not much. I've learned that a man has been calling at all the homes of London vicars and asking after girls living in the same house. Daughters, wards, servants." "I'm sure that went down well. Did he know my name?" "I don't think so, but I didn't know it at first either. Not until I learned about the tragic disappearance of Anselm Holloway's daughter 2 days ago." "And you investigated further," I finished. "How did you learn the piece of information about the vicar? How did V.F.?" He sat quite still, one palm flat on the polished tabletop. I thought for a moment he would keep that secret to himself, but then he answered. "A woman we'd been watching in Paris wrote to him. Her husband had died in suspicious circumstances here in England, and she'd exiled herself to Paris to avoid the police and us asking uncomfortable questions." "You think she killed her husband?" "I think she knew the killer and was possibly present for the murder. I also believe the murderer to be the man she wrote to, this V.F. Her husband's body was cut open and the brain used to stop." I pressed a hand to my lurching stomach and drew in a deep breath. "So you watched this woman in Paris and waited for her to send a communication. You must have intercepted the letter." "I did. She'd written it in code and tried to have an unsuspecting couple deliver it, since the usual postal service would be too slow and unreliable. I intercepted it and decoded it. The letter claimed she'd found the girl V.F. was seeking, and that she was living with a London vicar. I don't know how she learned that. I then made sure the missive found its way to V.F.'s hands, thereby putting the girl, me, in danger. You weren't in danger because you weren't living with a London vicar. You didn't know that at the time, and I would not have allowed V.F. to capture you. Forgive me for doubting your competence on this, Mr. Fitzroy, but you are only 3 men, if you include Gus and Seth, and there are many vicars living in London. You couldn't watch them all." The fingers on the table splayed wide. "Tea," Seth announced as he entered the library with a tray. Behind him, Gus followed, carrying a second tray laden with plates and slices of cake. They set the trays down and began to pour and pass out plates. There was enough for them too. It would seem they were to join us. The household arrangement was odd, and I still wasn't sure whether the two men were supposed to be servants, assistants, or something else. Not friends. Fitzroy certainly didn't treat them as equals. "You need a maid," I told Fitzroy. "Hi," Gus muttered as he handed me a plate. "I'll dress these two in livery." Seth had been about to hand me a cup and saucer, but he held it back. "I am not wearing livery." "We're not bloody footmen," Gus added, pulling up a chair. He sank his teeth into his slice of cake, scattering crumbs over his chest. "Then you definitely need a maid," I said. "And footmen, too. Is money a concern?" "No," Seth said. I arched a brow at Fitzroy, but he didn't notice. He pushed my plate closer to me. "You should eat." "I told you, I'm not hungry." "Eat." "Better do as he says," Seth warned me. "He likes getting his own way." Fitzroy shot him a flinty glare that turned Seth's face pale. He cleared his throat and sipped his tea. I nibbled the cake to appease them. It gave me time to think anyway. It seemed I knew something Fitzroy didn't. What VF looked like. "I saw him at my father's house," I said. VF. I assume it was he. Father called him Doctor. "Doctor?" Gus shook his head as he swept crumbs off his jacket. "If it's the same man we're after, the one who chopped Mrs. Calthorne's husband into pieces, then he don't cure people." Fitzroy sat forward. "When was this?" "The day you kidnapped me. I sometimes sit in the garden of my old home." I looked into my teacup, not wanting to see what they thought of my pathetic behaviour. "I overheard this doctor ask if there was a girl living there. He even mentioned my name. He must have learned about me having gone missing through neighbours or parishioners. Or via publicly available birth records. Either way, he'd done some research before his visit." "What did he look like?" I described the doctor as best as I could. I would recognise him again if I saw him. When I saw him. I had no doubt I would be seeing him again. I think he gave Father his name, but I didn't catch it. Seth set down his cup in the saucer with a loud clank, and Gus stopped chewing. "Why didn't you say so?" Seth said. "Sir, shall we go now?" "Prepare the coach and horses," Fitzroy said. Both men ran from the room. Their keenness unnerved me. Neither man had shown much intensity until now. It seemed I'd given them the first true clue for discovering VF's identity they'd had in a long time. "Can you learn where a man lives from his name?" I asked Fitzroy. "Yes, particularly if he's a practicing doctor. If he's not, there are still ways." He got up and strode from the room. I raced after him, almost tripping over my skirts in my haste. I picked them up to keep them away from my boots and caught up to him in the entrance hall as he retrieved his hat and gloves from the hall stand. "You're going to my father's house?" I said. "Yes. And then on to the doctor's as soon as you can connect his name to an address." "It might take some time to find the address." "You may not need me to lure him out after all." "Hopefully Holloway will give us the name without coercion, and VF will be found easily. If not, you will be required." His thumb and forefinger stroked the brim of his hat, and I suspected he was contemplating saying something else. But then he strode away toward the door, leaving me standing there by the hall stand. "Mr. Fitzroy," I called. He paused and raised his brows at me. "Can I come with you?" "To Father's house, I mean." He lowered his hat and faced me fully. "You wish to speak with him?" I think so, yes." "You don't need to. I'll get the information from him in my own way, if necessary." I suspected his way meant beating the answer out of him. While I wasn't entirely against the idea, I did want to see my father, and speak to him. It was time, and I had a lot of things to say. "If you intend to scare information out of him, I think he may need me. He won't be too frightened of a mere human, but having the devil's maid in his midst will scare the stuffing out of him." Answers too, I expect. Then you better fetch your gloves. I recognized the elderly women leaving my father's house with baskets over their arms. They were two of his most devoted parishioners, and a more pious pair never existed. As they passed Fitzroy and me near the front gate, I ducked my head so that I wouldn't be recognized, but I needn't have bothered. They were too intent on their conversation. I caught snippets as they walked away. "Poor, poor man," one said. "Will his suffering never end? What has he done to deserve such a life?" "Excuse me," I called out to them. They stopped and gave me benign smiles. Neither seemed to recognize me. "Has something happened to Mr. Holloway?" "The house was burgled last night, poor man," one said. "While he was asleep upstairs," the other chimed in with a shake of her head. "The vicious animal gave him a solid crack on the head, too. Poor man." I bit the inside of my lip. "Is he all right?" "He has a headache, but he's up and about, thank the good Lord. And who are you, dear?" She squinted at me. "You look a little familiar." "I'm new to the area," I said as I turned away. One of the women sniffed at my rudeness. Then I listened as their footsteps receded. I glanced up at Fitzroy, only to see him already looking down at me. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. Now more than ever. I needed to check on Father. The door opened a mere crack upon our knock. Father's face appeared, not the housekeeper's. I'd expected to be taken into a sitting room where we'd have to wait before seeing him. The delay would have allowed me to calm my jumpy nerves. I wasn't prepared for his skittish gaze to dart between us. It merely flicked over me, as if I didn't matter, and settled on Fitzroy. "This is not a good time." He went to shut the door, but Fitzroy forced it open with his shoulder. My father stumbled back and re-entered. "Who are you? What do you want?" He picked up a heavy book from the hall stand and held it aloft like a weapon. It was a Bible. He sported a gash on his temple. The red, angry cut crossed his frown lines. He looked much older than I remembered. His hair was greyer, the lines deeper, and his shoulders stooped. He hadn't been a young man when I was born, but he looked much older than his 55 years. "Do you recognize me?" I said. He looked at me again, and this time he actually saw me. And he knew. The mask of horror that descended over his face told me that. His eyes widened. His lips moved without speaking. "You," he choked out. "You!" "Me, your daughter. I've come to—" "You're no daughter of mine. Get out! Get out of here, devil's spawn!" He threw the Bible. Fitzroy caught it before it hit me. "You had some trouble overnight," he said. "What happened?" "What?" Father shuffled back toward the stairs. His shaking hand reached out for the newel post. "We won't hurt you," I told him. "We've come to ask you about the man who came looking for me a few days ago. A doctor. But first, are you all right?" I moved toward him, but he tripped over the bottom step in his haste to get away and landed on his rear. I clasped my hands tightly in front of me, stopping myself from reaching out to help him. This man didn't want me to touch him. It was clear from the twist of his mouth and the fear in his eyes. "Father, do not call me that," he snarled. "You are not my daughter. You don't belong here. You belong in hell. Get out!" He began a prayer as he scooted up the stairs on his behind. I bit back tears, refusing to let this man see how much his hatred affected me. I thought I'd given up hope of a happy reunion years ago, but it seemed a flame had flickered in my breast the entire time. I'd promised myself I would never feel anything for him again, and yet here I was, about to shed tears for the pathetic man I wanted to love me. "I am your daughter," I whispered, struggling to get the words out through my aching throat. He laughed, a manic, high sound that grated on my ears. "You're not. You're adopted." I fell back and reached out for something solid to hold on to stop myself losing my balance in the suddenly tilting world. Fitzroy's arm was there, his hand on my elbow steadied me. "You are not my father." The old man on the stairs stopped laughing and squared his shoulders. "No. How did you not see it? Your mother was pure of heart. I am the Lord's faithful servant. And you are a creature of darkness and death. The Lord sent you to us to test me. I didn't fail. I cast you out, as the devil should be cast out. I removed the ugly cancer from my house and—" Fitzroy's fist stopped the vomit of insults. My father's head, no, Holloway's, snapped back. He cried out and clasped a hand over his mouth. Blood seeped through the fingers. He scrambled further up the staircase away from us. Fitzroy followed him, his hands closed into fists at his sides, his shoulders rigid. "Don't!" I shouted. Holloway had reached the top of the stairs. Fitzroy stopped, towering above him. "The man who was here calling himself Doctor, was it he who came last night?" Holloway closed his eyes and began praying again. "Answer him," I said, "or he'll kill you." Fitzroy glanced at me over his shoulder. I shrugged. "You won't be harmed if you tell me his name," Fitzroy said. He kicked Holloway's foot. Holloway pulled his knees up and clasped them to his chest. He opened his eyes. "Yes, it was the same man. He wanted to know where you were." He nodded at me. "I told him you'd gone to hell." You probably won't be surprised to know that hell looks very much like the slums of London. I felt numb, like I was looking down on the scene from afar. But more than that, I felt like I was speaking to a stranger, not the man I'd called father for as long as I could remember. "His name," Fitzroy prompted. Holloway eyed the fists at Fitzroy's sides and swallowed. "He's a doctor. Frank something, I can't remember. His initials are VF. Is it Dr. Frank?" "I told you, I can't recall. It was an unusual name. Foreign." Fitzroy leaned over and grabbed the front of Holloway's smoking jacket. He lifted him until he was no longer sitting. "Think." His eyes widened to the size of saucers. Frankenstein? Dr. Frankenstein. That's it. Dr. Frankenstein. First name Victor,